discussion of John Kain. And the point I want to make is that sort of scholarly innovation comes in a variety of forms. What John and Ed did was to describe, chronicle John's career, talking about basically race and space and how they interacted in this. And it's quite clear from this table that John had a huge influence, and as Ed pointed out, an influence on how, just what people studied, not only that they read his things, but what they studied. But I want to talk about John's more recent involvement in education policy and education research, which first you'll notice that none of that appears on this slide. That is not there. And secondly, I'm going to make the sort of bolder claim that although his work in education is a bit different than what's chronicled here, it's likely to have the largest long-run impact. And I'll try to make that case in a simple way. So in order to understand John's education work, I have to put this in a little bit of context. To my knowledge, the first time that John thought about education was when the Coleman Report came out in 1966. The Coleman Report was a study commissioned under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was to describe inequality of educational opportunity around the nation. And what came out was this massive report in 1966 that was very controversial. There are two central elements, one of which is the most controversial, and the other was just sort of slipped in the Coleman Report. The first thing was that in trying to chronicle or to describe the variations across schools, you had to have some metric. So if you see that some schools have lots of books and other schools have lots of experienced teachers and so forth, you have to have some metric. And so the Coleman Report really invented the idea that you ought to pay attention to the outcomes or performance. And I'll come back to that in a second here, because that's part of this story. What made the Coleman Report controversial was the fact that it was widely interpreted as saying that schools don't make any difference. And that led a lot of people to be concerned about this, particularly people who were interested in social policy, because they were looking to education to be the lever that was going to bring about more equality. Now, one thing that was overlooked in this study also that relates to the description that Ed was giving before on race was that the Coleman Report also documented this huge difference in performance and achievement between whites and blacks that had never been chronicled or described before. In simplest terms, if you call a white in the urban Northeast in the 12th grade a 12th grader, blacks in the 12th grade who lived in the rural South were achieving at the 7th grade level. And frankly, that part of it really got John's attention, along with the fact that it seemed to suggest that there wasn't much hope, at least in the traditional public schools. Now, the Coleman Report was heavily criticized, and why this is a personal story to me. My first professional publication was joint with John criticizing the Coleman Report for their sort of bad use of analysis of variance, essentially, is what it comes down to. And that they mischaracterized the whole problem, or at least the results. Now, what you see on, I've left Ed's table up here, that work was done in 1967, 68, when we were together. I was going to graduate school and John was at Harvard. We wrote this paper together, and then John went on to write papers that are cited 350 times and so forth in another area, and so basically said, Rick, go clean up this area, or something like that, or you can't play in the big leagues, but you can work on education things. I continued to work on education things most of the time. Although I was profoundly influenced, it never sort of dawned on me that I was influenced on this. My dissertation that came out as a book called Education and Race. And somehow I got this idea that you had to pay attention to race all the way along too, and that was going to be important. So, putting this further into perspective, what the Coleman Report had done was to go out and survey and test 600,000 kids across the country and find out performance differences and then try to relate those to characteristics of their schools and their 3,000 schools and so forth. After the Coleman Report came out, there have been hundreds of other attempts to do this kind of work, and all of those have built upon some small localized sample with hundreds of students in them. And here's where I want to get into the sort of what I would call research and development work of John Kain, because what he did was to sort of build on this notion of the Coleman Report that you want to look at performance and so forth, but he had figured out in the early 90s when he was visiting in Texas down there that Texas had started an accountability system and started testing all the students in the state of Texas. And so this is probably a little bit apocryphal, but Mary Pam can correct me if I'm wrong, but he sort of wandered over to Austin one day and started talking to people and sort of saying, well, you've got all this testing data, why don't you give it to me? And he had some initial successes. The people gave him some data, and so he said, well, I have these data, maybe I can get this other block of data. And he went on and he started asking people about this in the Texas Education Agency and so forth, and they started supplying him with data. And Dan O'Brien was the person who actually had to organize it a little bit. What came out of this is the Texas Schools Project at the University of Texas at Dallas. And it doesn't appear on this list, but as somebody remarked, there are sort of 5 papers at this conference that grow out of that or something like that. And that's just the start. Because what he did was to show that you could take normal administrative data that exist in Texas and to use that to learn about things that we didn't know about or that we guessed at. We have a few hundred observations and we try to make up for the poor quality of these observations with all kinds of econometric techniques, but it's really to get around the fact that we don't observe what we want to observe. And he sort of said, well, what would happen if we could observe what we wanted to observe? And so, perspective time, he figured out that you could collect information on every kid in the Texas public schools and follow every kid in the Texas public schools as they progressed across time. And then you could get other cohorts of kids. So the Texas public schools currently have about 4 million kids in them. Imagine following 400 million kids over time and across spaces, no matter where they move in the state of Texas. And that's compared to this Coleman Report that for a long time was the only sort of really major national data set. And all of a sudden, you can see what's going on. Because if you follow a kid as he or she progresses through school, you can see how the experiences they have might flip them onto different trajectories of learning. And as you see different kids come through classrooms with individual teachers or individual programs, you can suddenly see how individual teachers and programs might affect these trajectories. And so all of a sudden, it's pretty obvious, I think, what you can do. Now, why that's important is, and what I'm going to argue, is that the Texas Schools Project is really sort of a prototype of how to use administrative data for the kinds of research we want to do. And it's become suddenly magnified in importance because of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, actually 2002, but who's coming? That law says by 2005, every state and union will test every kid in grades 3 through 8 in core subjects. So all of a sudden you see that everybody is developing these administrative data that can be used to try to figure out what's going on in schools. And you suddenly see, and Sonny's going to talk a little bit about this, and so on, and some of the other people, Tom Kain and others in this room, can talk about how the concept has, in fact, grown. So let me end by saying, and talk a little bit about, bring it back to John's own research program, which is a very, very important part of this, but it's the real picture is not the research, his own personal research program, but the real picture is the influence on what can be done, what people think can be done, and how they do it. Now, let me start with his first research project that Ed has identified already, was some work with Dan O'Brien that basically wanted to look at the idea of what happens when you have a lot of suburbanization of the black population, as we've observed in many states and around the country. What happens to their schooling opportunities? And what can we say about how the changing spatial structure, particularly by race, is likely to impact, has and is likely to impact on the achievement and outcomes that we observe. His second research project that I would point out is one that's currently ongoing, actually, another one with Dan O'Brien, which was to try to link these administrative days on schools with the rest of the world. So John didn't satisfy himself with just talking to the Texas Education Agency, but he started talking to the Workforce Commission in Texas. He started talking to the Higher Education Coordinating Board and so forth, and seeing what happens when kids with different achievement levels leave school and go on to college or out into the workforce or to jail, which is the criminal justice part of this whole thing. And his own research on this got into the questions of what happens when colleges are required to change their stance on affirmative action. What happens to the admissions policies and the availability, access to college of black students? And so started a project to look at the 10% rule of Texas, which says if you're in the top 10% of your high school class, you're guaranteed admissions at the UT schools if they go to school. But think about that for a second. That was introduced as an alternative to affirmative action. Now, why would that be an alternative to affirmative action? How could that possibly help? Well, the reason why it helps is that we have this strange distribution by race, by school, by location. And it's again this location and race interaction that would make a 10% rule have anything at all to do with affirmative action. And so that was what drove him to be interested in that kind of question. Now there's another set of papers that that I know a little more in depth that I've worked on with John personally. Steve Rivkin and John and I developed a long collaborative relationship through the Texas School Project. So I welcomed him back into their study of schools after he had gone off and just done a little work here on the edge. He came back to work with me on school issues. And we've worked on a whole variety of questions of teacher quality and mobility of students and special education and so forth. But the project that obviously had the largest interest to him was one that we've done, there's a paper available called New Evidence on Brown versus the Board of Education, which went back to the question of how does the racial composition of schools affect student performance, and is there an independent influence of segregation? Now, amazingly, just as a little bit of intellectual history, Brown versus Board of Education that outlawed de jure segregation in 1954 and was later expanded to include de facto segregation of schools. In the aftermath of that, we know extraordinarily little about the impacts of that on any learning or achievement of students. And it has been a subject that has received very little attention. And so that's why John was particularly interested in this question. We have a paper that we've been working on and keep working on that basically says higher racial compositions, higher black concentrations in schools is bad for black students. And it doesn't seem to affect white students at all, so it's a really effect on black students. And this is the topic that John wanted to pursue more. At a very personal level, the week before John died, I was at the hospital with him, and he had trouble speaking at that time because of the way things had gone in the hospital. He couldn't speak very easily. And in the time we had together in the hospital, he said, "How's the revision coming?" That the revision is coming well, John, and it's going on. And then finally, let me just mention as sort of supporting evidence on John's influence on this. There was a memorial service at the University of Texas at Dallas at the end of August. Was that the end of August? And at that memorial service, Secretary of Education Ron Page had sent a letter down of his condolences in this because the Secretary of Education realized the importance that John had and I think will have in the future in the education issues.